Chapter 34. Captivity Day 30 Gowrie. Matching the movements of the Xinan while remaining cloaked had worked well. Rigging that 8-pack missile launcher in the cargo bay was risky. She hit her target, but it didn't do as much damage as she hoped. Dumping the disposable missile pod bought her a few extra seconds, but she would be dead were it not for Vikir's intervention. The Kachinas had taken a harder beating than she expected. The cloaking system was damaged beyond repair. The reactive armor plating needed servicing. Hull integrity was down by around 60%, and the jump engine cooling system needed some love. It was a 3-day jump to the Vok region's Starlink. She was going to have to drop out of jump space periodically to vent the excess heat. It would burn through her trillium reserves, but it had to be done. She would need to stop at a space dock to do proper repairs, but the Kachinas was a strong bird. She could make it. During her first stop to vent the engine, she forwarded a copy of a long-range scan to TRO. Not knowing what was going on must be maddening to her friend. Surely, routing messages through the Nadrock relay should be safe by now. TRO. Frosty, when you're done with your morning digestive pyrotechnics, report to the lower command deck, Dizzy's voice said over the ship intercom. She could hear Maori laughing in the background. I hate all of you, she grumbled as she flushed one more time. After getting herself cleaned up, she headed down to take her place at the table. What's Bobtail doing here? TRO snarled at Nguyen. Hey, I tried hiding, he objected. You chased me down. You didn't try hard enough, TRO grumbled. Enough, Wodeo snapped. All Karzon on board have a stake in this, Roan said. Dizzy is here because she's in charge of communication and navigation. I wouldn't be here if I didn't have to, Dizzy smirked. It was unusual to have both captains on duty at the same time, so this had to be important. TR tried to just listen without glaring across the table at Bobtail. Maori status report, Roan said. Our tanks are at 40%. I'd like to stop to refuel before taking our trip through the Starlink. We've successfully connected the system scanners to the array on the Mongoose. I also rigged a kill switch for the weapon systems so we don't become a target for Frosty's Clefarian friends. Good. You're next, Dizzy, Roan said. Pass, Desiree smirked. I think Wodeo should take this one. I look Terran. The outpost on Jacker were unwilling to speak with me, but were more than happy to talk to her once I covered up her white stripes. Wodeo smirked. I almost botched it. I should have told them I was Shadowfang. I had to resort to flirting to keep them from asking too many questions. You flirted? Maori interrupted while trying not to laugh. It didn't take much, Wodeo sighed. I just left them wondering where my stripes are. Roan flashed a disapproving glance at Maori. I hate flirting, Wodeo grumbled. They were able to confirm the ships that set the ambush at Major were part of their hunter-killer fleet. It was an unsanctioned military action, but good luck keeping young commanders out of a fight. They don't have the capacity to mount a ground assault, so they just pinned down the Def Corp advanced fleet and ran their engines hot so they could vent their engines and jump away once the battle was done. Sorry, Tiro asked. Why run hot and vent while jumping? On basic scanners it looks like they were destroyed, Maori said softly. I offered to send in some Marines to take Major, but they weren't very happy that only a percentage of the landing teams would be Karzon. They agreed to us taking over all the orbital facilities, if we can help any of the surviving Karzon from the Def Corp fleet take their own planet back. Of course, Roan snickered, there's a reason Karzon have 2 paws. They beholden na but their pride in their starboardy paw, and a fist full of stupidity in their port, Maori said in a flawless Baron Deloric impression. Everyone else laughed while TRO sat in confusion. I think Dizzy should take it from here, Wodeo said. The Merc Marine ships working with the Havras Defense Fleet requested to join in the battle for Carmel, Dizzy smiled, so I directed them to contact Admiral Starchaser. You mean Vikir, Roan corrected. I didn't specify which Starchaser, Desiree grinned. They can figure that out on their own. If they can't tell the difference between the Baron and his brother, I don't see how that's my problem. Lady Kali of the Darkseed clan talked with Vikir, TRO blurted out. She thought he should act as his brother's stand-in. Seeing the looks on their faces, she added, just until he comes back. If they think he's already back, Bobtail said quietly, we'll be the only ones still looking for him. I'm still not talking to you, Tro snapped. He's still right whether you're listening or not, Dizzy scoffed. I think we're done here, Roan sneered. Almost, Wodeo said while resting her black paw across the top of Roan's white-furred paw. I'll just skip to the final update, Dizzy said. It looks like the Pilth Gate is coming back online, but it's an active war zone. Fuel up once we get to the link, Roan said. Coordinate with Tro's cyberpath contact, Wodeo added. Set Pilth as the exit point once he lets us know it's safe to pass. Will do, Dizzy said. Ooh. The shadow controlling the dead man, and the one speaking into his mind were the only two that remained in the control room with him. The others were in the large ring with flickering blue glow edits. No, that's what they call a stargate. The shadows had to kill the people in the ring around the gate to stop them from restarting a thing called maintenance every 15 marks of time. Minutes while the others destroyed approaching ships. The ones with arms. Oh, that means his weapons. The shadows needed him because he had a strong emotional connection to Somri, which they could use to find her. Tyrell. You're going to have to wait a few more minutes, Tyrell said. The last of the Cletharian fleet is going through now. It looks like the Darklings are planning on staying behind to make sure nobody else interferes with Stargate operation again. I'll send you a time usage code and let you know when you're good to go. After that, it's a straight shot through the nebula to my location. Tro knows the way. Do we have to worry about being followed? Desiree asked. Doubt it, Tyrell snickered. The Cletharians gave a solid trouncing to the Taz Corp main forces from Bedlam, Behayat and Milgar. I'm not seeing any activity out of Quantal or Core. I look forward to meeting you in person, Desiree smiled. I really am sorry about earlier, Tyrell said. It was meant as a compliment, Desiree said calmly. It's fine. The gate should be available now, Tyrell said. I'll see you in about 5 hours. He frowned darkly as the call disconnected. He'd made a real ass of himself earlier. He'd gotten far too accustomed to Jean Lavro and Sato Cho flirting with him. Desiree was quick to call him out on his lapse in professionalism. The Cheshire fleet was diminishing faster than anticipated. No Name had warned him that the Cheshire would lose interest as the reflectivity of plates on the lead ship diminished from damage or debris. He'd given instruction to his people to shove crippled ships toward the edge of the system, away from the constantly colliding Cheshire vessels. The unexpected arrival of a friendly fleet on the other side of the wall of ships wasn't unwelcome, but was generating a lot more hazardous space junk. The only way through at this rate would be to line up a few large ships and bore a tunnel through with the leading edge of their warp engine displacement fields. If he had any idea how bad this was going to get, he would have asked Tyrell for some ships to clean up all this mess. The addition of about a dozen heavier ships from the Havras system, coupled with Jerem's people crippling the planetary defense grid, had allowed them to take control of Carmel in just under a day's time. He was delighted when his sister, Sarah Starchaser, personally surrendered on behalf of the High Council and the people of Carmel. Def Corp had ordered the population to fight to the death. After Sarah's impassioned speech, they swiftly re-evaluated which side was worth fighting for. Curzon hated losing. His forces swelled as most of the remaining Defense Force ships were quickly overtaken by their predominantly Curzon crews. Vakir disabled transmission of ship audio during the battle, while Seaver transcribed his orders to the fleet. The Allied ships that hailed the IS Starrunner X-42 were informed they were having technical issues, but would be able to see Vakir in his command chair wearing a hat Tro sent him. He didn't feel right lying to them, but if they jumped to the wrong conclusion, he wasn't the one doing the lying. The odds were stacked against them before the battle began. If the IS-built starship had fallen as anticipated, the battle would have been lost. That crazy Blackbird's quick action saved more than just the Admiral and his ship. She had turned the tide before the real fighting had begun. The estimated 400 Xenon fighters had served as unwitting decoys, allowing their slasher ships to get close enough to take down the corvette and destroyer-class ships of the defense fleets. Hoeru had been charged with the 3 carriers they were able to fabricate in time for the battle. The costs on both sides were severe. 2 of their 3 carriers had been completely destroyed, one of which without firing a shot. The last few slashers had to force their way free of the launch bays. Of the 110 slashers the resistance entered the engagement with, only 42 remained by the time the day was won. Hoeru's carrier had been crippled. They hadn't planned for the mercantile marines joining the fight on their side, but Hoeru had cheered when he saw those beautiful ships appear at the edge of the system as hunter-killers uncloaked in the middle of the enemy battalion. It was the first surprise party he'd ever enjoyed. 3 penetrator-class ships, moving at double warp, and a lumbering starship that rivaled the Starrunner in size and strength were more than enough to turn the tide. The persistent beam weapons on their starship weren't as devastating as the X-42's mass driver, but struck with surgical precision. Curzon saw disgrace in surrendering. When a speaker from the High Council offered his brethren a new path to victory, they bared their teeth and overthrew their oppressors. As long as the Curzon were the victor at the end of the day, what did it matter what flag they flew? Hoeru's proudest moment was when he stepped off of his shuttle onto the deck of the Def Corp flagship Suzaku and took command to the cheers of the crew that had taken their destiny into their own claws and seized the jewel of the enemy fleet. Carmel was free, but his homeworld was still in chains. It was 1 jump day away, just under 3 days at standard warp. The crew was willing to push on to strike while their enemy was weakened, but Vakir wanted him to stay and help defend Carmel. After a lengthy argument, Hoeru set course for Major. If he was able to get enough support to punch through the debris field, he'd continue on course. If not, he'd turn back. It wasn't an ideal compromise, but it gave him hope. Melfrey. Such a hard day, I do deserve a nice leisurely walk. Those words echoed through her head over and over until she made them her own. Her pace slowed, and the sense of impending doom swelled until she reached the warning sign a few yards in, on the wrong side of the east gate. She wanted to turn and run away but could no more do it now than she had then. She knew it was a dream, but she could neither take control nor wake herself up. She could only stare straight forward, knowing what was to come. She knew the large gray rock halfway down the path was an animal, but it wasn't going to try to eat her yet. That was after the birds with invisible feathers swooped down while she stood unable to respond. Someone would then shoot them, splattering her with blood, which would draw the attention of a pack of fist-sized toothy poof balls. Not that it mattered. Not that any of mattered. Something in the woods was about to. "What do you have here?" a sinister voice whispered somewhere deep in her mind. "There's not enough meat on you to feed my young, but you'll make an excellent lure." The phalanx. Nelfrey never even got a look at it. It just stayed in the woods and dangled her like a worm on a hook to draw other animals out of the woods, provoking them to fight over just which of them would enjoy biting into her flesh. The creature's pups would dart out to grab the badly injured animals and drag them back into the brush. She had relived this horror over and over while trapped with her nightmares. She knew the gunshots would begin in time, and eventually, that gray pygmy Curzon would drag her blood-soaked, tattered body to safety, but the dream would restart again before that happened. It restarted sooner and sooner each time. He dragged her away, but had she lived? Was this all just the last flickers of neural activity winding down to eternal nothingness? Maybe this was Somri's revenge for failing her? The sequence started over, just as the thoughts of the Mother Phalanx voice faded. She was walking past the warning sign again. "What do we have here?" The creature's thoughts flowed through her once more. "I think I'm done," a childlike voice said. Nelfrey was startled that she'd heard the voice with her ears. One more time, a male voice spoke. "Go all the way back to that man in the car. Link with my mind. I want to memorize his face." Nelfrey tried to hide from the foreign psyche. There was something foul and terrifying about his consciousness. He was savage, cruel, brutal, drunk of her memories of agony and terror, but behind all that there was something else. Regret? "Name this person," the man's voice hissed in her ear as the playback of her memories paused at the point at which she was looking into the eyes staring through the slit in a car window. Dr. Ernst Smith, Nelfree heard herself whisper. I met him at the hospital. What did he want from you? The man asked. He tried to bribe me to sabotage the operation on Lady Darkseid. I said no. His presence seemed different momentarily. What's on that data stick he handed you? I don't know, Nelfree whispered. Return her from the brink, the man growled. I'll permit the A-room to live for her sake. Yes, Mr. Gowroon, a different child said nervously. Then can we have our family back? Only after you walk her through the full experience one more time, Gowroon hissed. Please no. Nelfree begged. Kiryu. You're free to go, the guard said as they lowered the force field. Yuri clapped. Her not you, the guard snapped. How much is his fine? Kiryu grumbled. The shopkeeper is pressing charges, the guard snorted. Work out a deal with them or wait until the courts decide. If that makeshift harness fails, he'll die in there, Kiryu attempted to reason with them. Please, Yuri pled, don't leave me. After ushering her out of the cell, the guard raised the barrier. I don't have a choice, Kiryu said sadly. Your Cayman godmother has to go bribe someone, then I'll be right back. I promise. Oh, and no jail breaks. Got it. Mama says breaking things is bad, Yuri said solemnly. Kiryu smirked. It would have been nice if he remembered that before knocking down the main support pillar in that dance studio. Sure, he didn't mean to, but still. The kid was a Kobe Tamj-powered wrecking ball. Just relax, Kiryu reassured him. I'll be back as fast as I can. Okay, he said pitifully. After leaving the security station, Kiryu called for a car. She really didn't look forward to facing Bruja after being brought in by system security. Yuri was a good kid. He was so helpful and polite. It wasn't his fault that he didn't know how to behave in a city. Lady Darkseid needed a firm talking to. Those kids needed to get out more, and that harness on Yuri was a piece of junk. Worse yet, they only had one. It was based on proprietary Jagaltim technology. The twins' hereditary condition was another problem. The proper protective gear for his species could kill him. There had to be a better way. The Black Church had ways of incorporating knack-like powers into devices, but they'd been in decline for decades. The ride to Alliance Arms didn't take long. Due to their business partnership, there wasn't much Bruja could do other than give her a hard time for getting brought in by security. If they allowed prisoners to pay their own fines, there would have been no need to involve anyone else. Bruja had dealt with enough emotional turmoil lately without adding her own little drama to the collection. Kiryu walked inside and headed straight for the office. As expected, all the workers knew where she'd spent her morning. She could feel their gazes, hear their whispers, and knew she'd be chasing them away from the curtain between the office and sales floor in no time. 270, Bruja said without looking up from her terminal. Huh. Kiryu said with a start. You're not going to give me a hard time? Cheap is fine, I've had to pay for you in years. Most of the damage was to the structure. Couple minor injuries, but that's on your new friend, not you. He's one of Darkseid's kids, not a new friend. Really? Bruja said with a smirk, only averting her attention from the screen momentarily. How'd you end up tearing up the town with him? That's a bit much, Kiryu objected. He was a huge help around here before we headed to the club. I offered to show him around town because I had the day off and wanted a change of pace. You took a child to a club, Bruja sighed. Of course you did. It was at 9th. Darkseid's people set it all up. They cleared the dance floor and had a pair of guards dancing with him. I was asked to keep him from getting bored while he wasn't on the floor. It was only for a few hours while his mother was going under the knife. After all that, you felt the need to bring him to a dance studio? Bruja asked in a tone laced with cynicism. He has this condition, Kiryu said. He can't handle the cold as well as normal Jagaltim, so he's a bit of an outcast. He's never even met a girl. He wanted to learn a little about his people's ceremonial dance. Their mating claw dance, Bruja snickered. And you thought that was a good idea? I know we don't have any native Jagaltim here. They'd fry in this heat. How'd you even find a teacher? I found a video and a Karzan instructor willing to walk him through it. Yuri wasn't trying to knock the place down. There are a lot of sweeping arm movements. I noticed we were short-stocked on daggers for size 2 customers, Bruja quipped. I don't suppose you'd know anything about that. Authenticity, Kiryu said in embarrassment. In hindsight. Bruja looked up at her and said, you don't say. I wonder whose fault it is that pillar got broken. The kid just misjudged the distance, Kiryu growled. What about the fruit stand? He lives on a space station with its own botanical garden. Paying for food was a new concept to him, Kiryu shrugged. The vendor was fine after I paid for the damage and food. I explained the situation and that was the end of it. And the jewelry store, Bruja smiled tauntingly. Transparent plasteel has a sheen to it, Kiryu said defensively. He didn't know there was a window pane. He was just trying to point to something. I smoothed things over with the owner. You told them to send the bill here, Bruja snickered. Awful expensive kid to have around for a cheap bitch like you. That's best bitch, Kiryu laughed. Not today, Bruja countered. More like most expensive sitter. Next time you take a day off, try not to make this much work for me. Come on, Kiryu chuckled. I heard Clotharia pulled out of Kaylani space, so shouldn't this be a good day? You didn't read the full news report, Bruja frowned. You need to start reading more than just the headlines. Why bother? Kiryu smiled. Why waste my time when I can count on you to fill me in on the important parts? Bruja shook her head. Actually, speaking of important parts, you're better than I am at tracking down unusual goods. Do you think you could track down a couple of those Jagaltim-made thermal protection harnesses? For, say, Gorgalians. Something adjustable that can accommodate both the black and gray subspecies. Kiryu asked. 2 of them actually. For your new friend? Bruja asked mockingly. It's unusual for you to spend money like this. What makes you think I'm paying? Kiryu scoffed. I'm going to bill it to Lady Darkseid's account, with a reasonable upcharge and finder's fee of course. I only let her cash out 100. There's plenty left. No you're not, Bruja scoffed. Not without proper approval. Fine. I'll ask that Tyrell guy she put in charge of her expenses. Why not ask the girl who's taking over for her? If I could get through to her, Kiryu scowled, I wouldn't have had to ask you to buy me out of jail. As for the twins, I'm sure she won't mind. Get approval or pay for it yourself, Bruja scolded. I will, Kiryu rolled her eyes. How generous, Bruja grinned mischievously. I'm not paying for it, Kiryu scoffed. Of course you're not, Bruja laughed heartily as Kiryu walked toward the hallway to her workshop. She brought up her contact list and limited the entries displayed 1 letter at a time until his entry was easily selected from her hundreds of contacts. She clicked to initiate it, but the call was rejected immediately. Maybe he dropped the call by mistake. She tried again but got the same result. She was all thumbs when it came to messaging with her comms unit, so she took out her tablet and wrote Tyrell a purchase proposal concerning the harnesses. Hopefully she wouldn't have to wait long for a reply. Kiryu walked back into the office and waited for Bruja to finish answering questions from one of the salesgirls before speaking. I couldn't get through. I'm just worried the makeshift rig he's using now may fail before I can get this resolved. You know who's pressing charges, Bruja said dismissively. Just by their cooperation. Problem solved. This isn't the Kaylani Dominion or Echelon space. A dance studio in these parts can't make that much. The damage to the building was significant. It's for the sake of one of her kids, can I? No, Bruja smirked. I saw what you did with that weapon sale to her. Including your commission, you pocketed 15 gal creds. The refund she was owed for the unneeded power cells I put in the shop coffers, Kiryu objected. That still leaves you 10 gal creds, Bruja snickered. You got him into this. Take care of it. We both know he's going to ask for more than his shop is worth. There has to be another option. You could always ask Gaorun to intervene, Bruja taunted. I could set up a meeting with him. Just say the word. I'll try to reason with the guy that owns the studio, Kiryu grumbled, but I'll keep that in mind as a last resort. Really? Bruja said in shock. You'd go that far to keep your purse closed? He's not a bad kid, Kiryu growled. I'm not going to risk him dying because some asshole wants to make an example of him. Section break. The overall population had dropped dramatically since the last siege of Hyrule a couple years back. The few shielded structures and Blade's Edge were left mostly unscathed. Out of the 10 subterranean levels of the city, the first 2 had been at least partially condemned, and everything below the 6th had been sealed off for centuries because of some kind of infestation. Nelfree lived in a staff housing block on the surface that was managed by the hospital. Kiryu had a good-size house on Subsidy 4. Bruja had converted her old shop in Blade's Edge into an ultra-high security condo. Most of the leveled plots were owned by someone, but not many were willing to sell. They apparently wanted to hoard the insurance payouts and wait to see if the system economy recovered, which wasn't likely to happen unless the new planetary management just got it over with and seized all the property. They'd already gobbled up some land to rebuild the essentials but stopped there. There were a few smallish available plots of land on the surface, but they were prohibitively expensive. Things didn't go well with the dance instructor. The amount he was asking for to compensate for damages to his Subsidy 3 dance studio was absurd. He must have been hoping to rebuild on the surface. Kiryu enjoyed having money too, but there was no point to negotiating if he refused to be reasonable. Kiryu contacted Bruja to set up a meeting with the Metedador of Gestatios, who currently oversaw all administrative functions in the Havras system. The restaurant was currently undergoing remodeling, so making arrangements would take a little time. She tried calling Nelfree. No answer. She checked to see if she'd heard back from Tyrell. Nothing. That lamentic guy wasn't supposed to be back until sometime tomorrow, so there was no point trying to reach him. There wasn't any point contacting any of her other local friends. She didn't want to risk getting too distracted and miss an important meeting. She could get started on that replacement mask for Kali, but she'd need a template to model it after. She picked up a fox mask from a small shop before heading back to the surface. It wasn't quite the same as the original, but it was close, and even had a detachable bottom jaw that she could work into the upgraded design. This was not how she wanted to spend her day off, but it was an off-book side project that had to be done, so why not get started? Just after completing the 3-dimensional scan and render, her tablet beeped. Of all the people, Kiryu chuckled softly. It was a text-only message from Kali. Kiryu was a little disappointed that it wasn't sent to her specifically. Happy Liberation Day? Kiryu wondered. Well, at least her comms are back online. Kiryu sent a new group conversation request to Kali, but it was rejected. Was there a problem with her gear? Kiryu double-checked all her settings, then tried another message. This time she included an image of the mask. A text reply came in a few minutes later. It read, "Not secure now." Damn it, Kiryu grumbled. Aya wandered into her workroom. Do you want something? Kiryu asked. Yes, the Cheshire said nervously. I think so. I forgot. She wasn't supposed to be back here, so Bruja must have sent her. Kiryu grabbed Aya by the scruff and dragged her to the front office. What's going on? Kiryu asked Bruja as she released her grip on Aya. Go to Gestatios, park by the back door. You have 10 minutes, Bruja said, then threw her the keys to the convertible. You can take my car. Thanks, Mistress Bruja. Kiryu grinned as she darted toward the sales floor. Just don't provoke him, Bruja called after her. Kiryu had never actually met Gaurun. He had to be nicer than his predecessor, Corbijani. It took her 8 minutes to drive to Gestatios and another to find the back door. She lowered the top, turned on the radio, put the car in park and waited. An intense feeling of dread welled up inside of her as a slat in the back door slid open. Before she could react, she felt 2 clawed hands grab her shoulders and slam her back against the seat. She whimpered in fear. Someone was in the car behind her. She could feel their breath moving the fur on the back of her head. Their fingers were unusually long, and the claws of their thumbs rested firmly against her neck. Her heart raced. She had the intense desire to flee, but one twitch of his hand would sever the major arteries on each side of her throat. Why are you here? A voice hissed from behind her. They weren't speaking the bestial common tongue, but the Cayman dialogue. I need to talk to the... She began but forgot the correct term. Then talk, the distinctive male voice hissed. I was asked to look after a Ja Gal Tim child, she stammered. He's in jail. I need to get him out. Really? The menacing voice growled. One of Goliath's spawn? I don't know who that is, she answered pitifully. Then who? The man in the back whispered as terror welled up inside of her. Who is this? He could be one of Lady Darkseid's enemies. What if he hurt Yuri? I don't know you, Kiryu whimpered while desperately trying to regain her composure. She watched the back door, desperately wishing Gaorun would look out and see she was in danger. Do you really want to be back there threatening me when Gaorun comes out to meet with me? Kiryu bluffed with all the confidence she could muster. She heard her unwanted passenger chuckle. It was soft at first but grew louder as it transitioned into a terrifying belly laugh. Kiryu gulped hard, held her breath and closed her eyes. Mental abilities have no effect on her, so she knew this wasn't just some head game. You amuse me, pup, the voice spoke. The hands were gone. She slowly turned to look behind her but nobody was there. She nearly jumped out of the car as her tablet beeped. She heard the slat in the door closing as she checked the message. It was the jail messaging her to let her know they were releasing Yuri. What the fuck was all that? She whispered in a shuddering voice. Whether or not that was Gaorun, she really didn't want to stay here to find out. She backed out of rear the alley and started on her way to pick up Yuri. Much to her surprise, she saw Nelfree wandering down the street, wearing a tattered, blood-stained nurse's uniform. Kiryu slowed down as she neared her. Hey sexy lady, Kiryu giggled, want a lift? Her head was lowered, one of her pant legs had been torn up to the hip, the other ripped open below the knee. There were 2 holes in the left side of her top, exposing the deep gray fur on her shoulder. The right side by her top, by her waist, looked like it had been partially consumed bite by bite. Just leave me alone, Nelfree cried. Not a chance, girl, Kiryu said. Not with you looking like that. I can't leave you walking the streets looking like that. Let me take you home and get you cleaned up. Nelfree slowly raised her head and turned to look toward the car. Her eyes lacked their usual sparkle. She looked pained and haunted. The movement of her eyes seemed slightly out of sync. I have to get Darkseid's kid, but I'm not abandoning my best friend. Jump and let me take care of you. We can talk on the way. I killed her, Nelfree bellowed. Then some guy sent me off to die. They should have just let me stay dead. Kiryu winced. Killed who? Lady Darkseid, Nelfree said mournfully. You should check your tablet more often, Kiryu teased. She sent a message earlier to all her contacts. I can't, Nelfree whimpered. It was eaten by something but I'm not sure what. All those teeth, all the crunching. I don't have one anymore. She'd clearly been traumatized but she wasn't making much sense. Cully was clearly fine, and if there was something wrong with Sam, why would that lamentic guy have told her he'd be back tomorrow to pick up Yuri? Please get in the car, Kiryu urged. I'll buy you a new one. Just let me help you get yourself put back together. Put back together, Nelfree muttered, then collapsed onto the ground crying. Kiryu slammed the car into park and leapt out to help Nelfree inside. I must be a mess if you're offering to pay, Nelfree teased half-heartedly. I've got you, Kiryu said warmly as she guided Nelfree to the passenger door. Dahlia. A lamentic man with sharp features and short, unkempt hair stopped by the doorway and waited quietly. He was dressed in grayish blue and black, the colors of House Nascali. Dahlia watched and took notes as the neural imaging system updated. The next pass would be in another 30 seconds. The rate at which the alien gland was adapting to Samari's pre-existing neurology was increasing steadily. It had been slow until that Cletharian fleet gated into the Psi-Ez system and started exterminating the Xynon colonies throughout the region. They hadn't expected the rival hive mind to have an effect on her recovery. The Cletharians may not be talkative, but they clearly understood what had to be done. What do you need, Lord Iolan? Dahlia asked the lamentic. I want you to check on my sister, he said irritably. Senna and Artemia are confident she was fully primed this time. I want Oleander out of here on schedule. If she wasn't impregnated this time, Would you be willing to declare Fury infertile? Lord Gainan would have my head, Delula said apologetically. Island scowled. Nobody's happy with this arrangement. Delula isolated portions of the scan to double-check a few readings. It looked like tendrils from the so-called Queen's Mark were starting to integrate themselves into Somri's corpus callosum. How's your timeline looking? Alan asked. Much better than yesterday, Delula said. If everything continues at its current pace, we should be able to try waking her up sometime tomorrow evening. Just let me take a few more notes, then I'll go check on Lady Fury. I'll be waiting with my sister, he snorted, then walked away. Delula sighed. House Nascali might be ranked highly in Lamentic culture, but they were one of the worst to deal with. Cracks. Akia leaned across the bar, holding up her empty glass, pitching her left leg to one side as if daring anyone to glance at the shadow beneath her skirt. The bartender looked over and held up a finger to let her know he'd seen her. Akia ran her fingers through the black hair extension on the side of her head, drawing it in front of her so it rested against the leather cup which held her left breast firmly in place. A fairly attractive young Shamfarian man leaned across the bar, motioned toward her and said something to the bartender. The bartender nodded, refilled the man's drink and started mixing another drink for Akia. She smiled and waited. Grax sat at a nearby table watching the exchange as he had on numerous occasions. He was a Namdak with a brown stony calcite outer structure, and bound silicate on top of his head. Gender-based concepts were not applicable for his species, but he opted for male pronouns for the convenience of others. In a few seconds the Terran man would take the drinks to Akia. If he struck her as crude or indecent, she'd invite him to accompany her elsewhere, drain him dry with her leech and leave his empty husk in an alley. The Echelon government was on the hunt for a serial killer, but he knew it was just a Lamentic on the hunt. There's the coy smile and the laugh, always with that hollow look in her eyes. This was her pattern. Prowling sleazy bars looking for a certain sort of man. Last time he wanted to speak with her he'd observed this ritual, followed her to her disposal location, and talked while helping her dump the corpse of her victim. The E2 needed a knack trainer, more so now that the local government had enlisted the assistance of a Lamentic mercenary. I took hold of the man's hand, holding onto one of his fingers, and walked away. That was new. She walked over and sat down across the table from Grax. Not tonight, Grax asked as he saw the young Shamfarian heading to the door. He's in the Defender program, she said with a shrug. I could tell when he handed me my drink. I also knew you were watching me. Did you check with those people of yours? Yes, Grax answered. Your fee has been approved. If you're interested in a Dujari becoming your new defender, I'll leave that to you. I'll swing by your encampment tomorrow to meet your team. Thea smiled. Don't worry, I know where to find you. What I don't know is who you're working for. I'm currently in the service of Lady Darkseid, Grax said while studying the Lamentic to gauge her response. There was no visible reaction. When should I expect you? Grax asked. When I'm ready, Ah grinned menacingly. Happy hunting, Lady Alaru, Grax said. I'll see you tomorrow. Make sure you have my first payment ready, she said in an icy tone, and just call me Akia. Grax bowed his head to her, stood and left. Maze. It was nearing midday on Erosha when Maze returned to the temple complex. The back of her head still hurt from where Shivar had cuffed her before leaving. He apologized immediately afterward. He wasn't trying to hurt her. Maze was more delicate than the people he was accustomed to. He had given her a lot of good advice before his departure, and helped her see Lady Darkseid and more importantly herself differently. Her father had pressured her into accepting a role she wasn't ready for. How could she be the leader her nation needed if she didn't really understand the wants and needs of the population? His perspective was so different than that of his daughter. Then again, due to life circumstances, Labarth was more involved in raising Vorshana than Shivar was. Parentage could be a factor as well. Vorshana's biological father was a diplomat from Ilianti who had hired Shivar to assassinate her mother, Cindy, for the life insurance money. Shivar killed him instead of her once he realized she was a female Laika. Shivar and Cindy were married in secret not long after. Either way, Vorshana considered it the duty of the citizenry to serve their nation, whereas Shivar insisted leadership should be treated as a form of service. He was quick to admit it was an arduous ideal to achieve, and took constant vigilance to maintain. His answer was a little evasive when she asked Shivar if he ever achieved this ideal. She was determined to succeed where he'd failed, and this meant spending some time learning more about each of the roles within the Kailani Dominion so she'd be better able to rule, once she was ready to reclaim her role. She dreaded trying to explain this to Vorshana and her father. If nothing else, their treatment of Kali was proof something had to change if the nation was to endure the challenges to come, and with the return of Kalmia just beyond their borders, that would be no small feat. She took a deep breath as she marched into the central temple annex, not as Mistress Kailani but just as herself, merely Maze. Labarth. The stonework flowed together like water and rose to meet him as he sat and stared. The willow in front of him was no mere hologram. This one was very real. Hidden deep within an outpost nestled in the Gaffin system, just beyond Zynon's space, Labarth struggled to understand the visions of past, present and future being conveyed by his unseeing eye. He was unable to focus on anything more than 2 days in the future. A branch, long, weak and withered, had expanded into 2 nearby limbs. A new branch had torn a hole in the side of the tree, swept downward and continued coiling around the trunk, tearing off bark as it continued to bend the tree into a tangled mess. That was Kalmia. The widening branch represented the Karzan. Knowing what they represented told him nothing of why this had happened, or why everything grew darker and blurred more than 2 days in the future. The willow creaked as a crack began to split the tangled branch representing the Zynon species. It was a strange sound. It wasn't a crack or a pop. It almost sounded like the ancient willow had sighed. In shadows the tree does sigh, preparing for its day to die, Labarth recited. Whither will the tree of life, soon will come the day of fright. His perch merged back on the ring around the tree as he stood and returned to his quest to find some way to redirect the flow of times to the ends he had long sought. I never should have sent that child to Midguard, Labarth grumbled. The Zynon were capable of warping spacetime to make a corridor that has been dubbed slippery space. The Kailani Dominion had used this as a safe, swift way to pass through the nebula for decades. The plan seemed simple enough. Fly the adamancy through the nebula, fire up the jump drive, and head straight to the Dominion-controlled outpost in the Elvran system. The ships they encountered while passing through the nebula defied reason. It was hard to believe any living thing could survive moving at that speed for any length of time. The Zynon ships fell swiftly, disrupting their corridor through the nebula. The crystal-shelled command ship went dark. Their ship continued forward toward the edge of the nebula at conventional warp speed. Once there they could spin up the jump drive and make their escape. The enemy vessels were too small to be equipped with jump drives. When Barath said she must keep her light shining while passing through an army of shadows, she thought it was a metaphor. Lilac had never been so wrong in her life. They didn't board the adamancy. They emerged from the shadows cast by every console and piece of furniture aboard the ship. Ruka's Dareth ancestry allowed her to blend into shadows. This trait prevented them from devouring her along with the rest of the crew. The living shadow attackers were unable to reach Lilac through an aura of light she encased herself in. They hid in a corner of the bridge waiting to be free of the nebula. Once they were in jump space, they'd deal with any remaining shadows from the ship. Hopefully her strength and concentration would hold out while listening to the sounds and smells of the dark creatures slowly consuming the remains of the ship's crew. Kali. Bruno stood looking out the penthouse window down through the aperture in the ceiling of the special containment building next door while Kali finished repositioning the furniture they'd already moved over. When I first arrived, that is where I was held, Bruno mused. From the far side of the ring I could just barely see the top of this building, and now it is to be mine. Someone has to take care of it after I leave, Kali said as she started walking toward him. In 30 days' time, Ojeran will be on his way home. Strawberry will be on her way to my base of operations, and my Techmare will arrive to take me home. I may not be able to give you back what you lost, but you can use this place to help people who have nowhere else to go. Since we first met during that event, you struck me as a man in need of a noble cause. He held out his hand as she drew up beside him. Was I wrong? Cully grinned up at him as she took his hand. No, he said as he looked down, smiling warmly. You should probably check on them. Is that your way of getting out of helping me drag the bed frame up all those stairs? Cully giggled. I wouldn't mind some help, Bruno snorted quietly. They got a room together in town, Cully shrugged. I'd rather give them more time to help themselves to one another. A work crew was due by to inspect the plumbing, electricity, climate control and network connections in a few hours. After all that was dealt with, she'd be ready for company. Bruno had grown up on a primitive world, so living without modern amenities wasn't a problem for him.